بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم نحمده ونصلي ونسلم على رسوله الكريم أما بعد. Yesterday's chapter was about how powerful the supplication against the child of the parent is, and I mentioned that there is an account recorded by Imam Bukhari in another of his books known as Al-Adab al-Mufrad, where he relates that account. And the hadith is as follows. Abu Hurairah radiyallahu ta'ala anhu narrates, I heard the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sallam say, no newborn has ever spoken in the cradle except Isa alayhi salatu wassalam, the son of Maryam and the companion of Jurayj. It was said, O Prophet of Allah, who is the companion of Jurayj? He alayhi salatu wassalam replied, indeed Jurayj was a monk in his monastery, and there was a shepherd of cows who would come to the lower part of his monastery. There a woman from the village would frequent the shepherd. His mother came one day and said, O Jurayj, whilst he was praying. He said to himself, my mother or my prayer? He decided to prefer his prayer over his mother. Then she called him for a second time, and he said to himself, my mother or my prayer? And he decided to prefer the prayer over his mother. Then she called him for a third time, and he said to himself, my mother or my prayer? And he decided to prefer his prayer over his mother. When he did not answer her, she said, Allah will not allow you to pass, O Jurayj, until you see the face of an immoral woman. Then she turned away. Then the aforementioned woman who had given birth was brought to the king. He asked, from where did you give birth to this child? She replied, the father is Jurayj. He remarked, the resident of the monastery? She replied, yes. He said, destroy his monastery and bring him to me. So they struck his monastery with axes until it fell. Then they tied his hands to his neck with rope, and he was taken and made to pass by the immoral woman. He saw them and smiled whilst they were looking at him amongst the people. The ruler then said, what is this one claiming? He, Jurayj, replied, what does she claim? He said, she claims her child is from you. He asked, do you claim this? And she replied, yes. He asked, where is the child? They said, it is the one in her lap. Subsequently, he faced the child and asked, who is your father? He miraculously replied, the shepherd of the cattle. The ruler said, should we make you a monastery out of gold? He replied, no. He asked, out of silver? He replied, no. He asked, then what should we make it out of? And he replied, return it to the way it was. He, the ruler, inquired, what made you smile? And he replied, a matter which I recognized. The supplication of my mother against me affected me. Then he informed them of the entire story, again recorded by Imam Bukhari in his Adab al-Mufrad, and also elements of it in his Sahih al-Bukhari. So this hadith indicates just how powerful the supplication of a parent is against a child. Okay, a few subtleties of the hadith. So what is the actual ruling if someone is performing prayer and their parent calls upon them? So the schools of thought are almost unanimous on, if the prayer is an obligatory prayer, a fard prayer, then you continue with your prayer unless you are certain that there is dire need and help that the parent requires. So let's say there's a fire that's broken out in the house, and your parent calls on to you and they are in danger, then even a fard prayer is broken. Otherwise, if it's just a call on to you for some type of assistance, or just for whatever other reason, but not in extensive need of your assistance, then one would continue with their fard prayer and then tend to their parents. But in the case of an optional, meaning sunnah or nafil prayer, then the ruling is that if the parent is unaware that the child is in prayer and they call on to them, be it something that they desperately need help for, or they're just calling on to you for, make me a cup of tea, whatever it is, okay? Then if it's an optional prayer and you are certain that your parent doesn't know that you're in prayer, but they've called on to you, then the jurist ruled that you need to break your salah and tend to your parents. So you break your prayer, you go and tend to the parent, and then you come back and you repeat your prayer. And the difference between the fard and the optional is the fard is a responsibility to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He has mandated on you. And thus there is no obedience to anybody when the Creator is being worshipped and obeyed. So you cannot break that for anybody else. But in the optional prayer, it is not mandated on you. That's something that you've decided to do extra. And so in that case, the parents' call would supersede your actual prayer. And you will not be sinful for breaking the prayer. In fact, you'll be rewarded for attending the call of your parents. I have a friend who's senior to me, mashallah, is extremely pious. I refer to him as from the Aslaf. He's from the Salafus Salihin, but he lives in our era. And he tells to me that even my phone, because he, mashallah, is very habitual of optional prayers. Daily he performs Salat al-Tasbih, etc. So he's almost in Salah all the time. So he says to me that when I stand up for optional prayers, I have a special ringtone for my mother. His father has passed away. So when that ringtone goes off, I know that I need to break my salah. And that's in accordance with this, that if the parent summons you when you are in optional prayer, then you need to break that prayer. This hadith is indicative that such is the power of the parent's dua, that even though Jurayj, which is the name of the monk, was in worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, by not responding to the parents' call and the frustration of the mother, that she made a remark that, "O Jurayj, may you not die and leave this world until you see the face of an immoral woman." And the whole story was that Jurayj was someone who didn't frequent the people anyways. He stayed in previous ummams. That type of worship was allowed, where you stay away from women, not married, and you worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and do nothing else. The Prophet ﷺ said, "La rahbaniyata fil Islam." In Islam, there is no concept of monks and monasteries and that type of worship where you forget your other responsibilities and you just worship Allah. This type of worship doesn't exist in Islam. But in previous ummahs, it was allowed. So this person had no dealings with the rest of society. He simply stayed in his monastery and worshiped. That's all he did. And yet, the powerful dua, or the power of the dua, was that despite him apparently having no association, and when you think about the dua, that a person who has no contact with people, this type of dua, that you will not die until you see the face of an immoral woman, and how that manifests itself, that no connection with that woman, but she accuses him of fathering the child. And still the dua is not manifested in its complete form. But as he's being dragged in front of the king, he's made to pass by that particular woman. And when he looks at her, he realizes, and that's why he smiles, that subhanAllah, that as my mum was leaving after she called me and I didn't answer her call, and she made that supplication, this is Allah allowing this supplication to manifest. He wasn't worried about the consequences, because he knew Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would absolve him, but just the fact that my mother said this, and this is the manifestation of it, that I'm made to see the face of an immoral woman. And so again, referring back to yesterday, that parents need to be careful with what they say to their children when they're upset, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accepts that. So despite the anger maybe being excessive as well, be very careful of how you respond with that anger to your child, lest the consequence of that dua and supplication is something that your own child has to suffer later on in their life. So the moral behind this that Imam Bukhari is trying to push through and make us understand is that the supplication of the child, of the parent towards the child, especially when they're frustrated, is something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala listens to. So the understanding is that one needs to be dutiful to the parents. So instead of taking a supplication against themselves, they take supplications for themselves. Because if you're dutiful to your parent, your parent's not going to respond by making bad dua and making dua against you. If you're dutiful to your parent, the parent is going to make dua for you, which is the objective. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant me the understanding, all of you the understanding. وآخر الدعوة الحمد لله رب العالمين. سبحان الله بحمده سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك.